Well, welcome to this breakout room. We're going to discuss Geneva digital landscape in the areas of AI and big data. My name is Katharina Hoene. I'm a senior researcher with DiploFoundation. I will briefly hand over to my colleague Natasha, who will help me manage the discussion for some housekeeping rules.
Hello, everyone, from my end. Welcome to today's session. In case you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the text chat or to raise your hand. And we kindly encourage you to also switch on your camera so that we can have a very interactive discussion with all the participants in the room. Kat, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. So we have 25 people in the room. It's very much appreciated. And as Natasha said, we are looking forward to your comments and questions. Before we get there, let me lead us into the discussion by basically saying we have two main purposes for the remaining 20 minutes. First is to talk a little bit about the Geneva digital landscape in AI and big data. And then second, to already start looking at what is needed going forward in terms of mapping, but also in terms of bringing the various actors together. I thought it's quite useful to start with the roadmap on digital cooperation by the UN Secretary General, which was launched 10 days ago, because there are some really interesting points on the global needs for AI governance. So the roadmap identifies a lack of representation and inclusiveness in global discussions. It also identifies a lack of overall coordination among AI initiatives. And then it makes a third important point. It says that there's no common platform to bring these separate initiatives together. And I think these points are also to a certain extent relevant for the situation in Geneva, which we're now focusing on a bit more. So as Jovan said, we are preparing this mapping. And in that regard, I actually want to share with you our mapping in the area of AI and big data. So I'm going to share my screen now and hope, okay, here we go. Okay, so what you see on the screen now is an overview of the kind of mapping we started to create. And you see various international organizations for now as the focus, and obviously some very, very familiar faces like the ITU, not surprisingly in terms of places where people come together in the area of AI, the AI for Good Summit. I also put the AI for Health Focus Group from the ITU together, and some other publications, as well as places where issues and people come together to discuss things related to artificial intelligence and big data. Also not very surprising to find in this mapping, the World Economic Forum. There are two places in particular where people come together that are under the chairmanship of the World Economic Forum, which is the Global AI Council and the WEF platform on AI and machine learning. As you can see, there are some, I guess, some familiar faces like GCSP, UN GGG on laws, ISO standard setting, WIPO, and some other organizations. So this is the landscape as we have it now. I'm going to share the link to this with you now, so you can actually look at it while we're continuing the discussion. Just as another intro, I would like to get a sense of the kind of situation in the room by having a quick poll with you. So the question we're asking is, when it comes to Geneva organizations working in the area of AI, and you've just seen the overview, I know, so you know who is working on what and whom to contact. So how do you feel about that? Do you strongly agree, strongly disagree, agree, or are you somewhere in the middle? This is going to be really interesting to basically see where you are standing and perhaps how important this map is. So I'm going to close the poll now. We have quite a number of answers. We have 17 people. Perfect. Sharing results. So it's really interesting on this question of, do we know who is working on what and whom to contact in the area of artificial intelligence when it comes to Geneva landscape? The majority basically says, no, I don't quite know who is working on what and whom to contact. So that's really, really interesting to keep in mind. And luckily, it confirms that, in fact, there is a need for the kind of poll, for the kind of overview we are creating. Wonderful. With that, over to you for basically this question: how do you experience the Geneva landscape in the area of AI? What are your observations? Perhaps if you look again at the map we've created, what is missing? How did you, well, experience that so far? What are the key things we should be looking at perhaps? What are we missing from the map? These kind of questions. Anyone? So let me ask in another way. Is there anyone in the room who is working for an organization in Geneva that also looks at artificial intelligence? And would you like to share your perspective from your organization looking out at the landscape in Geneva? And then also perhaps for those who in the poll answered, they are not quite sure what is happening in Geneva in terms of artificial intelligence, and they're not quite sure who they can contact to kind of foster this conversation in this area. What do you think is needed most from your perspective to help kind of close that gap that clearly our poll identified? Okay, there are a couple of questions. So Teresa, thank you for that question. Surprising findings in the mapping. I think there were a lot of familiar faces in the mapping, so to speak. So the organizations we obviously would expect, and as I showed the map, ITU, World Economic Forum are obviously two very important organizations in this area. So not so surprising there. What I found really interesting is when we started to dig a little bit deeper. So for example, GCSP came up as an organization that creates space for dialogue in this area and comes up with policy and research in this area. So that was really an opportunity to kind of look at exactly what they are doing and exactly the kind of wealth of information we already have in terms of policy papers, in terms of research papers. And that's something that the map I showed reflected partially, because I only picked one example for each organization. But once you actually unpack this a bit more, for me personally, the surprising thing was how much information there is, which obviously then poses a challenge, because this is one of the areas of my research, and I realized there's a lot more to read and a lot more to digest. And the challenge now is how do I manage that actually? Which again, bringing these different actors together to collaborate more would actually also help with that issue. So I see a couple of questions from, for example, from Delphi Ramirez. Would you like to come in by voice? Because it would be really great to A, hear you, and B, see you. Okay. Also a really important comment by Pippa Biggs from the ITU. Hi, Pippa. I think we already met in person in Geneva. So the Geneva landscape is working well. So you introduced this very interesting distinction between doing AI and working on policy or following trends in AI. Would you like to elaborate also from the perspective of ITU, which is obviously one of the key organizations there? Okay, and from our perspective, we can definitely say that we are including the challenges of international organizations. So we are including both, basically. So organizations who use AI in their work, and in our mapping, for example, there's a kind of small lab at CERN that is actively using AI in their work. But obviously in Geneva, another important aspect is in terms of policy, in terms of policy papers, input, advice into policy processes from the perspective of the various organizations. And I think there, is a lot of wealth of research. So basically we're focusing on both. And I think a very useful distinction is basically to distinguish between venues such as the AI for Good Summit or what's happening at the World Economic Forum, concrete policy input, and then more broader research papers in various areas.
If I just may, it's Natasha. We have Aminata who would like to take the floor, and then Delphi.
Perfect.
Hi. I'm Aminata. I'm currently in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, but so I'm working remotely for an NGO that is based in Geneva called Women at the Table. And Women at the Table with Ciudadanía Inteligente, Intelligent Citizenship, has something called the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms. Something that I'm currently working on is sort of like a project that tries to kind of map what's going on in AI, but specifically how international organizations are reacting to the fourth industrial revolution, and so sort of how our traditional organizations like the UN or activist organizations, how are they able to play a role in the regulations that we need for AI? And of course, by default, most of them are in Geneva. And so that's how today's conversation is very, very relevant to us. So as I've been looking through documents, I was thinking, and I hope it's relevant to everybody, it's kind of, and I have heard other people say it in the other breakout session, but also in the discussions, it's the tangibility of the information that organizations give. So, and also I understand that policy documents are very difficult for most people to understand because they speak in a particular, with particular jargon. But even with what they do give us, it can still it can still isolate a lot. And I think when it comes to data and AI, it's a discussion that needs to include as many people as possible. So I'm wondering, what do other people think about the information that's out there? So, I mean, we can agree that we need more, but from the information that's out there, how tangible is it? And how accurate is it in depicting what will happen or what is happening on the ground?
Definitely a really good question. I'm not going to jump in there. I think let's take the other comment from Delphi and then open the floor further up. So Delphi, over to you. Okay, some challenges there, which is understandable. Really good point. Also in the chat, Pippa Biggs from the ITU just elaborated a bit more what the ITU is doing. Also reminded that the AI for Good Summit is taking place digitally this year, which also means that perhaps even more people can participate and can join sessions. Delphi, would you like to try again? We're trying to sort this out. Let me get back to the very, very important intervention from Aminata. And I think it really picks up very well on something we heard in the plenary on different languages being used, different terminology, which already at that stage kind of introduces a first hurdle. And we also see this in artificial intelligence. It's a very broad term. So one of the first questions is obviously, what do we mean by that? Then we add big data, algorithms, then so there's a lot going on, machine learning. So we have to be very careful of what we actually mean by artificial intelligence because it's so broad. And the other point obviously is in AI, there are also policy silos. So there is a debate on lethal autonomous weapons, which is obviously very different from a debate on AI in the healthcare sector as one of the ITU focus areas looks at. So again, we are confronted with this challenge. And I think as we continue with this mapping, we will find more and more. I'm not quite sure what the answer is because this challenge was very clearly identified in the plenary. We also found it in our research. But at the same time, we can't enforce a certain way of speaking about this. So it kind of has to come from bringing people together, agreeing on a common language, a common kind of terminology voluntarily. Okay, I see a very interesting comment from my colleague, Ginger. Ginger, if you would like to take the floor, please do so. Otherwise, we can also read your comment.
Thanks, Kat. And I know I've been talking about this throughout. As you said, Tenga Tai made a very good point in the plenary about interpreting, and you summarized that very well. But do the mapping projects take this into account? What happens to someone like me who finds it fascinating, but that can't even navigate the basic terms and what other people are doing? Does the mapping level start out for those who are entering, or are you really focusing on the experts and reaching researcher to researcher and advanced concepts? So what about adding a layer, or is this already contemplated, a layer for those that are just coming into the area?
I think that's a really important point, because very quickly, as you said, we're getting into a very technical debate. As with any issue in internet governance, it gets technical very quickly. The same is true for artificial intelligence, and obviously that raises the entry hurdle already very high. But I think with this mapping, we're not trying to speak to the experts. Of course, it's very important to bring the experts together, because as we've seen, there's a lot of need for dialogue and coordination. At the same time, I think it's very important to do such a mapping with a focus on creating inclusiveness. So this point that Johan made in the plenary, everyone needs to know who to call when. So if I'm new to the topic of artificial intelligence, and for example, I'm interested in, let's say, AI in warfare, which organizations can I go to get some basic information, which also includes needing to explain some basic concepts. I think these are probably two different mappings. One mapping on AI and one mapping on the Geneva digital landscape of actors and issues in this area. But the two have to be somehow connected to really make sure the entry point is low and we're not just speaking to the key issue experts, which is obviously very valuable. But I think it's very important to go beyond that, to have a very broad conversation on this issue. So I think it's a very important reminder, because also myself, I get very quickly into the technical discussion without keeping in mind that some people might not be able to follow as easily as others. Natasha, I just saw out of the corner of my eye that it's getting actually very active in the chat. Can you give us a quick summary, or perhaps call on the people who should be taking?
I would like to give the floor to Aisha Piotti from Horizons, who has her hand raised.
Yeah, hi. Fascinating. I think my question is a bit related to the question of inclusion, and inclusion particularly of the businesses. So, today there is a lot going on in AI policy. At Reg Horizon, we're sort of linking the needs of the business to practical solutions that we can make in that area. Now, in order to do that, if you run through the whole Geneva maze, and a lot of the companies, and that can be smaller or medium-sized companies, they're obviously looking at global horizon for such technology. And whilst they have a few things like EU that they can look at, they'd like to know what's happening in the global Geneva, where can we go to when we have specific questions, and is that something that we can have? So even, globally on a global front, if we have specific questions from the businesses, from smaller companies, how can we connect them? So one is to know the big, the ITU is working on it, and World Economic Forum is, but in practical sense, that's not so useful. So that would be something that from our perspective would be very useful, like specific people, are they contact names that we can connect, get advice on, and that way we can actually even include the businesses in that discussion much better and more efficiently. So,
excellent point.
Like a scenario where we take a question and we say, okay, now I have this, I come to you. What do we do? Where do we go? How do we pose it? How do we get the solution? Who will be the person? So really practical.
Yeah, very good point. We will take it on board. And it actually brings us back to this question of, do we need an organization who coordinates all of that, so that you would call that organization or that entity who then refers you to others. But very good point also on the mapping, which we will think about more. Thanks.
Kat, we are running out of time, so I just shared the link in the chat for our participants to head back to the main hall for the conclusion of today's event.
Yes, thank you so much. I noticed that the chat almost exploded towards the end of our discussion. I'm very sorry we didn't have the time to bring all these voices in, but thank you so much for the questions and comments we received. You have the link to the mapping if you want to have a look further. Otherwise, see you in the main hall now. Thank you.